If you already have a sourdough starter and you've started milling your own flour, you might be wondering, can I actually feed my starter fresh milled flour? The answer is yes, and it's much simpler than most people think. You don't need to start a brand new starter, and you don't need a complicated process to make the switch. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I feed and maintain my sourdough starter using fresh milled flour, what changes you can expect, and how you can easily transition the starter you already have into a fresh milled starter. Fresh milled flour actually works beautifully for sourdough starters, and the reason comes down to what's inside the grain. When you mill flour at home, you're using the entire wheat berry, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. That means your flour still contains all of the natural nutrients that were originally in the grain. Those nutrients are exactly what the wild yeast and beneficial bacteria in your sourdough starter love to feed on. Because of that, many people actually notice their starter becomes more active once they begin feeding it with fresh milled flour. One of the biggest concerns people have when they start milling their own flour is whether they need to start their sourdough starter completely over. And the good news is you don't. If you already have a healthy sourdough starter, you can simply begin feeding it with fresh milled flour. That's it. Your starter will naturally adapt over the next few feedings. What I usually do is start exactly the way I normally feed my starter. I remove a portion of the starter and then add fresh milled flour and water just like I would with any regular feeding. At first you might notice the texture feels a little different. Fresh milled flour contains the bran and the germ from the grain, so the starter can feel slightly sticky, thicker, or a little more textured than when you're using all-purpose flour. That's completely normal. After a few feedings, the starter usually settles down into a new rhythm. And honestly, this is one of the things that I love about sourdough. It's incredibly resilient. These cultures have been around for generations and they're very adaptable. So you don't have to worry about ruining your starter by switching to fresh milled flour. You may even notice that your starter becomes more active because fresh milled flour contains more nutrients and the wild yeast and bacteria often have more to feed on. Many people find that their starter rises faster or becomes bubbly a little sooner than it did before. So once your starter has adjusted to feeding and maintaining, it really becomes just as simple as it always was. Once your starter has adjusted to fresh milled flour, the day-to-day maintenance is actually very simple. The process for feeding a fresh milled starter is really the same as feeding any sourdough starter. The only difference is the flour that you're using. When I feed my starter, I start by removing a portion of the starter from the jar. This is your discard and it can be used in lots of recipes. I'll link a few in the description for you to try. This helps keep the starter at a manageable size and keeps the yeast and bacteria balanced. And then I add fresh milled flour and water. I usually aim for a texture that's thick but still easy to stir. Fresh milled flour absorbs water a little differently than store-bought flour, so sometimes I add just a little more water if the starter feels too stiff. You're looking for something that feels like a thick batter. One tip I like to share is that I keep a little extra fresh milled flour in my freezer for feeding my starter. This makes feeding your starter more convenient in that you don't have to mill flour solely for that purpose. And this is one of those areas where sourdough doesn't have to be overly precise. Once you've done it a few times, you start to recognize the texture that works well. After feeding, I'll sometimes mark the level of the starter on the jar so I can see when it's rising and when it reaches its peak. When feeding with fresh milled flour, you'll notice that your starter becomes active fairly quickly. So sometimes mine's ready in about 3 to 4 hours depending on the temperature of the kitchen. That's because fresh milled flour contains more nutrients for the yeast and bacteria to feed on. If I'm planning to bake that day, I'll leave the starter out on the counter and use it once it reaches its peak. If I'm not baking right away, I keep my starter in the refrigerator and simply feed it when I'm ready to bake. Once you begin feeding your starter fresh milled flour, you may notice a few small changes in how it behaves. And most of these changes are actually really positive. The first thing that many people notice is that their starter becomes more active. Because fresh milled flour still contains the bran and the germ from the grain, it provides more nutrients for the wild yeast and bacteria to feed on. That often means your starter will bubble more vigorously and sometimes reach its peak faster than it did when you were feeding it refined flour. For example, some starters that used to take 6 or 7 hours to peak might now be ready in 4 or 5 hours depending on the temperature of your kitchen. Another thing that you might notice is that the texture of the starter can feel slightly thicker or more textured. That's simply because fresh milled flour includes the bran from the grain, which adds a little more structure to the mixture. So if your starter feels a bit heartier than it used to, that's completely normal. The aroma can also be a little more complex. Many people notice a deeper, tangier smell coming from their starter when they switch to fresh milled flour. All of these little changes are signs that your starter's adapting to a more nutrient-rich flour. And once it adjusts, it usually becomes very predictable and easy to maintain. So once you've made the switch and your starter has settled into its rhythm, maintaining it really becomes a simple part of your baking routine. Once you start feeding your sourdough starter with fresh milled flour, you'll probably find that it quickly becomes part of your normal kitchen rhythm. The process really isn't complicated. Your starter adapts and it becomes active, and before long it feels just like an easy rhythm as it always did, just with the added benefit of using fresh milled whole grain flour. If you'd like a written step-by-step guide for everything we talked about in this video, I've put together a blog post that walks you through how to feed and maintain a sourdough starter with fresh milled flour. And I'll link that below so you can reference it anytime that you're baking. And if you're ready to go deeper into baking sourdough with fresh milled flour, from choosing your grains and creating and maintaining your starter and baking beautiful loaves, my course Grains to Loaf walks you through the entire process step by step. It's designed especially for home bakers who want to confidently bake nourishing sourdough bread using fresh milled flour without feeling overwhelmed. You can find the link to the course below as well. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure you subscribe below as we learn together.